Welcome to Reimagining the Internet from the Initiative for Digital Public Infrastructure at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. We're talking to researchers, techies, activists, academics, and journalists about what's wrong with the Internet and how to fix it. I'm your host, Ethan Zuckerman. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Reimagining the Internet. I'm Ethan Zuckerman, your host. I'm recording today from Copenhagen, Denmark, and I have two wonderful authors here. I have Vincent Hendricks, who's a professor of formal philosophy at the University of Copenhagen. He's the director of the Center for Information and Bubble Studies, funded by the Carlsberg Foundation. Good morning, Vincent.
Good morning, sir.
I also have Camilla Mehlsen. Camilla is a digital media expert and spokesperson for the Danish organization Children's Welfare. She's the author of several books on digital literacy, and her work on digital media has been published in various newspapers, magazines. Someone who is thinking a great deal about these questions of how digital media is affecting young people. Good morning, Camilla.
Good morning.
They, together, are the author of a new book called The Ministry of Truth, Big Tech's Influence on Facts, Feelings, and Fictions. It will be coming out at some point this spring in Springer Nature. And it's an incredibly cool book. It's a book that really centers on one of my favorite topics, which is the subject of attention. We often talk about the attention economy. One of the arguments that you make in this book is that that's an oversimplification of what's happening with attention. How do the big platform technology companies see attention, and how are they working to capture and manipulate it?
So basically, the idea that we came up with here actually dates back to a Nobel Prize laureate, Herbert Simon. He got the Nobel Prize in 1978 for his studies on bounded rationality. But already back in 1971, he said something very prophetically about an information age for which there's a lot of information available. That means now. He said that in an information-rich world, the wealth of information is going to mean the dearth of something else. It will be a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. But what information consumes is pretty obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. And there you have it. In the information age, it's not microchips or oil. It's people's attention, but not as a cognitive asset, mind you. So why attention is important to us as cognitive human beings is the fact that it's a gateway to our consciousness. That's what William James said back in 1889 in his book, The Principles of Psychology. Now, the way in which the big tech platforms and the business model of most of these platforms is basically they don't consider it a cognitive asset per se. They have understood the fact that whatever consumes our attention is information. And once you consume people's attention with information, you generate engagement. Once you get engagement, you get traffic. Once you get traffic, you get data. Data you can harvest, analyze, pack it, and sell it to the advertisers. So basically, they went from having attention as a cognitive resource to becoming a capital asset. And that is basically the business models of most of all of these platforms.
So let's just pull that apart because there's a lot in there. When we take attention, we are in the simplest sense saying, I now want you not to be thinking about this. Instead, I want you to be focusing your attention over here. That also becomes a marketable commodity in the sense that you could redirect that attention from what you thought you were paying attention to an advertisement. And in many cases, the advertisement says, let's put your attention somewhere else. It also creates this derivative product, which might be at least as valuable, which is knowing where your attention goes, knowing where you want to put your attention becomes a commodity in and of itself. But this is not as simple as selling coal or sulfur or something like that. How does attention differ as a commodity from the ways in which we're normally used to thinking about markets?
Well, attention is of great value in the 21st century. What we've seen in the past 15 years or so is that some of the biggest, largest companies in the world, they are based on the attention business economy model. And we see, okay, let me just say that we thought once the internet was out, this is, this was back in the 90s, right? We had this ideal of a very democratic internet that we could all, share our thoughts and, we might get equal amount of attention. But what happened in the 21st century is that we've seen that attention online is not equally distributed. We see it's very uneven. We see some people, some kind of content get a whole lot more attention. We've seen the rise of influencers. We've seen the rise of some politician gaining a lot of attention. We've seen some kind of content like rage or hateful speech might get more attention than more everyday content. So the whole idea of the attention economy might be based on that we can all have a voice online, and then you see some ads. But what we are seeing is a change in that it's some people get a lot more attention, and that's, of course, that raises a lot of problems when you think about, is that what we want for democracy?
Well, I also would imagine that it raises a lot of problems for youth, right? So I have a 12-year-old son. He sees himself as a content creator, which I think is essentially what everyone wants to grow up to be at this point. He would be thrilled if somehow his YouTube channel had 1,000 followers rather than 100 followers. His parents and I ensure that his YouTube channel has followers that we know and have vetted. So we are spoiling his possibility of becoming a leader in the attention economy. How are you thinking about how this affects young people when we're thinking about this idea that attention becomes the central commodity, and some of the ways in which people can gain attention are pretty self-destructive?
Young people today, they do grow up in a digital attention economy. They do see that when they know from a very young age, then if you have an account on TikTok or Instagram or other kind of social media platforms, you can see how many likes do I get, or how much attention do you get. You have quantitative measures to attention, and that do impact everybody, but especially young people. Like if you are 10 or 12-year-olds or 14, is the amount of likes and attention you get, is that because people like you? We do see that it does this whole system has a negative impact on the self-esteem of young people.
It's almost as if, I'm sure the struggles that all of us went through in middle school and high school, where we try to figure out, are we popular? Are we unpopular? Do the right people like us? Do they like us for the right reasons? Now suddenly has a number attached to it. And not only does it have a number attached to it, but that number then in turn also gets a price tag. And so we're essentially sort of forced in all aspects of our life to sort of think through this attention component to it.
The whole difference is that you're being raised as a strategic communicator. Will this give you more attention than that kind of content? The difference is from when we grew up and we're back in high school. It's not just the people around you who can see how popular you are. Now it's the audience is much bigger. The potential audience of who's popular and who's not is much bigger. And what is concerning in this, that you might think that, everyone has a voice. A 12-year-old, you can actually get a lot of, you can make money, or you can get out there. But what we don't discuss enough is that the undermining structure is not democratic. Some people do get a lot more attention.
Sure, and I think just to follow up on that, if you look at attention as an asset, it's a pretty weird asset compared to what we usually consider assets to be. So that would be cash money, it would be stock, right? Or it would be more what should I say, fantastic sort of financial products like derivatives or something like that. But the interesting thing about attention is now I'm looking at Ethan, so I'm not looking at Camilla, so I'm burning all my attention on Ethan, there's nothing left for Camilla. So it's a zero-sum game when I use it, and we don't multitask very well. I can't take my attention and then basically put it in a bank and get an interest on it or take it back out. Once I burn it, I burn everything. So it's a very elusive asset compared to the other assets that we are usually trading in. But the market is being ruled by the attention economy. So rather, the information market is being ruled by the attention economy. And the problem with that market, as Camilla was also alluding to, is that that's not an efficient market. It is not such that on a market, that an information market will sort of converge on an equilibrium for which all the good information will survive and all the bad information will sort of get weeded out in the very liquid market of people exchanging information and opinions. And so unfortunately, we are not there where we get the efficiency of this market. And on top of that, there's also another unfortunate structural component to the attention economy ruling an information market, namely that if you have a lot of followers, you tend to get even more. So there's a Matthews principle involved here, right? More generates more. And from that perspective, you get to this very uneven distribution of attention. If we thought that attention would be distributed in accordance with normal distributions, that means that the bulk of us can receive and take just sort of the same amount of attention, then things would be pretty dandy. But it's a power law distribution, right? So
famously, these are Pareto distributions, and so there's a tendency for the rich to get richer. It is perhaps not a surprise that this is all happening at a moment of extreme inequality. And now you have the possibility for extreme inequalities of attention. It feels like a meritocracy in the sense that some different people have the abilities to become very powerful within this. But at the end of the day, it still becomes more of a winner-take-all market. One thing that is interesting is that financial wealth does not necessarily translate one-to-one into attention wealth, which is super interesting, right? If it were just possible for Coca-Cola and McDonald's to put their money on the table and own as much of our cognitive capacity as they would like to, this would be a very boring space. Instead, maybe it's more of a cognitive casino at that point because we're always sort of looking for what might happen. So talk to us about what are some of the deeper sort of psychological implications of living in this world. We're in an economy that's deeply weird. It can't be translated into financial terms very neatly because attention is non-fungible in a very real sense. You can't infinitely subdivide it. You can't task switch your way to it. It ends up being finite. But this set of incentives changes our behavior online. Camilla, what are you seeing as far as how this is affecting young people and maybe society more broadly?
Well, you mentioned that this cognitive casino, the social media platforms, they are built on systems to gain our attention and to keep our attention. So there are a lot of it is in the devil is in the detail, right? So there's a lot of design that have huge impact on young people, and again on all users, but especially young people. The like button, or it could be the color of red and notifications. It could be the way smartphones use like sounds, like when you get a little buzz or something. All these little, the little details, they do have an enormous impact on the well-being of young people. We see that you compare each other. You compare yourself, your own identity with other people. That's what everybody does, but especially if you're a teenager, those are your formative years. That's where your identity is in full development. And so when you compare yourselves to, how many likes or how many, But let me say, social media platforms and then the casino of social media platforms have enormous impact, but we don't know is this always bad, or might be good. But we do know that it can be more like stressful to be in this kind of digital environment. I talked to some kids, like 14-year-olds, who, just to give an example, they use Snapchat a lot, and on a Snapchat you can use this streak. you can get a streak. So if I send you a Snapchat message, you will have to send me one back within 24 hours. And then we can do that, let's say for a year, then we will have a streak for 365 days. But then if I forget to send one to you, Ethan, but I do remember to send one to Vincent, then, we will lose our streak, Ethan.
Right.
Does that mean that
that's a big deal? What happened to our relationship?
Yeah, that's about,
We should talk about this.
Maybe I like, some other friends better than I like you because I forgot to send you one streak. My point is that these little things, the streak, the function of the Snapchat streak, they influence relationship. They are not neutral. So technologies are not neutral. The design have enormous effect, and we don't always know how, it might happen. The intentions of design might be different than how it's actually used. The student, or actually the kids I talked to, they told me that they've tried to wake up in the middle of the night with this, oh, I forgot to send I forgot to send Snapchat messages. And this example it's not a technological notification, it's actually an internal disturbance. It's the brain waking the kids up in the middle of the night to warn them, oh, you forgot something.
Right. This has become a very high priority. But let's examine for a moment. There's ways in which these attention economies have the possibility of more justice and more benefit than some past economies, right? We always have people coming in and saying, can't we just go back to the days where we just have newspapers and, television stations and media is predictable? One of the things that we know from that world is that not all voices were very well represented. In my country, we had much less representation of women, people of color online, queer people, migrants. You now have this possibility that social media gives us very different voices and sort of access to them. How do we take advantage of that possible benefit of this ecosystem and minimize some of the downside risks associated with it?
Right. So one of the things that we're discussing much in the book, in the latter chapters of the book, is what now? What are we going to do with this? Exactly, alluding to your point. One of the arguments that we're having is if we keep the business model intact as it is right now, and the argument that you get for being continuously tapped of data is always the same argument you're being presented with. It's better for your user experience. That's why. So we tab even more data from you, and by tapping more data from you, you get better search results, you get better feeds, and more in accordance with your interests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the entire idea of recommender-based algorithmic architectures, and that's a very important part of the business model. Now, there is nobody who has said that that's the only model that you can use, first of all, right? And so, for instance, the new Digital Services Act of the EU is actually alluding to a model in which it is less based, while you still have recommender-based systems. However, the results of these recommender-based systems is not target marketing anymore. The result of these systems should be chronological feeds or generic advertising, if you want to keep the business model intact by selling ads. Now, of course, that's a downbreak for the big social media platforms, because that means that their targeted marketing is going to be constrained somehow. But that in and by itself is actually, if you start restricting the business model, would be a way to make sure that there are limits, there are caps on how much data you can tap. So, for instance, the Digital Services Act now has a clause in it that says minors cannot be the victims of targeted marketing. Right. And so the basic idea is not to keep going into this rabbit hole that Camilla was talking about before. And so in a certain sense you could say really some of the initiatives that would be good would be if you look at the social media platforms, we have a whole chapter in the book called the clandestine casino. And that is basically the idea that you're tapping into behavioral psychology from B.F. Skinner through Fogg and onwards to make sure that people are continuously engaged. But there is nothing that tells you have to be continuously engaged. You could put a clock in a casino so people can see what time it is. You could put in windows. And the same goes for the social media platforms and principles. You could add in that you could only scroll so much, right? That you can't spend 11 hours on TikTok, et cetera, et cetera. So there are friction strategies that you could use that would change the game. Now, of course, the social media platforms so far, and Mark Zuckerberg has been very explicit about that. He's been saying, we want this to be online on our platform to be a frictionless experience. That would be one without frictions. And there's, of course, a good pecuniary argument to that. But you could install a lot of friction strategies that would actually either bump people back if they don't know the community standards of the platforms, or they have to reread those, more ways in which you could actually turn down the speed. That's the key, as James Taplin said in Move Fast and Break Things.
So let's play with the casino metaphor, because as we know, literally people who have been designing casino machines are now consulting for these firms. The book is very wide-ranging. One of the pieces that's very interesting is that you're actually considering the physical networks associated with these social media spaces. Why is it essential to get down and think on the level of cables and data centers and all of these technical levels that we like to abstract our way away from? Why is that a major focus in this work?
Well, in 2010, Facebook, Hewlett-Packard, and I believe Amazon decided to get their own fiber optic cable across the Atlantic. It starts on the east coast of the U.S. and then it ends up actually with an outlet in Denmark, and then it moves on to the rest of the world. Now, then we started to think about, well, that's basically the fiber optic cables that are transmitting the data across the Atlantic is basically the physical incarnation of the internet as we know it, right? That's where the action happens, right? And so we started thinking about, okay, where is this going to go? And then we read a paper that apparently said that in 2030, the big tech will sit on about 30 of the cables between the Europe and the Pacific. Now, that is basically the physical incarnation of the internet. And if you think about it from that perspective, not only do they control the traffic, they own the traffic lights, the billboards that you see on the way when you drive your vehicle, but they also own the roads. We are not only talking about bits, bytes, and upvotes and cat video sharing, we are also talking about the physics of it. And that is critical infrastructure. And at least in Denmark, the Danish road system is owned by the Danish state. And there's a reason for that. There's a democratic reason for that. And that reason is that every citizen of this country should have equal access to this infrastructure system. Nobody should have a better position in this system than others, basically because it's part of running the entire society. Now, if you start putting that out to private enterprising, you're not necessarily answering back to democratic principles, but to shareholders or advertisers or some combination thereof, unless the social media platforms, and we are beginning to see this, so on certain platforms a little bit, are beginning to take a greater civic responsibility for their operations.
And Elon Musk, when it came out that he could actually, potentially buy Twitter, he, of course, compared Twitter to the public square, right? Or the town square. Like the metaphor of like we have a place where we can communicate, but it's owned by Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and very few very rich people. The good news is we get it. I think we get it. we get it, and yeah, politicians get it. The EU is getting it. We're trying to regulate it, but with the Digital Services Act DMA. In Denmark, we have a much more discussion, much more debate about what now. We don't have all the solutions yet, but I think the Roaring Twenties will hopefully come up with some great alternatives.
Well, I think just to supplement on that particular point, namely, and also feeding into some of your work, Ethan. Look, what we have in Europe, and there are many reasons for that, and it probably also goes back to different societal models being entertained in the U.S. and in Europe. And one of the things that we do have here in Europe is an idea of the fact that where democracy lives is owned still by the people, right? And so now that means the users. So what we used to talk about as if they were just citizens of a country are also now users of a global internet. That is some distance now that we are talking that we haven't really moved into before. But the basic idea of the public square as being a place where everybody has equal access, where democracy lives and strives, is something that belongs to the people. Without it being socialist or anything to that nature, it's basically that model. And so that means that you have sort of you don't want to appreciate too much if public space should become on private hands. And that is for reasons of democracy. Had you asked the pioneers of democracy, ranging from Kant, Rousseau, and Montesquieu, as to whether or not public space should be on private hands, they would have come up with a resounding no. And the very reason is exactly equal access for everybody, no pecuniary interest should be running into space, etc. And that is still pretty close to the way in which we think of democracy in Europe. Whereas in the U.S., I'm also part American, you tend to look at it a little bit differently, insofar as to say, well, the marketplace of ideas is free. The same way goes for financial markets, they're free. Probably there is enterprising, there's demand, and there's supply, and those things will eventually get an equilibrium. And we have seen that has not really gone so in the financial markets. Neither have we seen that goes in when you come to the marketplace of ideas. And if you look at the pioneers of the marketplace of ideas, I come to think of two that we think of in the book. One is John Perry Barlow in his Independence Declaration of Cyberspace back in 1996, and another goes further back to John Stuart Mill. And I think both of them would be a little disappointed in the information age, because whereas John Perry Barlow would say, look, marketplace of ideas, throw in your opinion. We're past this thing about states who are running the show. Mill looks at it different. He says, look, eventually the marketplace of ideas was getting to an equilibrium given the wisdom of crowds, such that the truth will prevail in the end and the rest. And none of that has come to pass, right? None of that has come to pass. And so the danger is that the marketplace of ideas is being run by financial interests because they might have different interests. And you should also realize that Camilla was talking about Elon Musk and his potential takeover of Twitter. He says, look, I want to get Trump back online if he wants to get back online. And I could sort of see the argument. He was a publicly elected official. Why should he be barred from public space? That's a good argument. I buy that argument completely. However, Elon Musk has also been banning or wanting to ban certain accounts, one of them being @ElonJet. And @ElonJet is a Twitter account that keeps tab on where his private jet is at all given times. And he has been trying to get that closed. Now, if it doesn't show anything else, it will tell you that even Elon Musk is worrying about certain community standards here. Mm-hmm. Now, we can just discuss what they are, but there are some. So it's not unregulated marketplace of ideas, even for somebody who really believes in the marketplace of ideas being a free space with caps on it, though.
The Elon Musk case is actually demonstrating one of the huge problems and what we need to fix soon. No, Elon, you should not be the only single one deciding whether or not Trump should be banned or not, and whether or not what kind of content should get most attention. And that's what's happening now. We see, okay, Mark Zuckerberg 5 years ago it was okay to deny Holocaust, and then Mark changed his mind. Okay, so now you can't post anything like that. But it should not be very few, very rich people deciding not just designing the community standards. So what we are emphasizing is we want friction strategies about the community standards, but also what are the community standards? It's not just what kind of content is it that it should be anchor. And what about illegal content? There are many problems on this content moderation. But my point is, no, Elon should not be the single one deciding.
What's so fascinating about this is that if we take the logic of the fiscal marketplace, right? The fiscal marketplace is voting and saying, actually, we seem to be happy with Elon running this. We seem to be happy with Zuckerberg running this. But of course, we don't run our societies purely as markets. It may feel that way sometimes in the United States, that you can simply buy the legislation that you want the most. But generally speaking, that's not what we're sort of actually trying to do in these things. Whereas in the social media space, that's exactly right. Maybe it's worth $45 billion to Elon Musk to be able to take down Elon Jets. Maybe it's worth that much to him to be able to replatform Trump. One way or another, it doesn't seem like a rational way that we should run these sort of public spaces. So help me with sort of a last question here. What can Europeans tell us about this notion of digital public square, digital public sphere that Americans may have lost track of?
Well, first of all, you should realize that in Europe, there is a grand tradition for something called public service broadcasting. So basically, the state, in some way or the other, supports public service broadcasting. And that's actually also a way to bolster and to make strong the idea of public space, period, right? And so from that perspective, there is an attitude in Europe, or a lot in Europe, in Germany and Denmark too, that the state is actually part of bankrolling public media and to ensure public space. And the reason why that turns to be out as a reasonably good idea is that it actually makes for a certain independence of these public broadcasting entities, because they don't have to worry about competing for eyeballs or clicks all the time as much as the American media business is based on. So from that perspective, it's sometimes people will say, well, that means that they interfere, they intervene, it's about state-run television or state-run radio. Not really. It's rather, it gives them a break from worrying about making sure that you catch the eyeballs or you get the listeners to listen to what you're saying. So from that perspective, it gives them less bias. It gives them less incentive to walk in a certain direction. And from that perspective, it has actually a liberating editorial freedom that comes with it. And so one should realize that it's not running it completely, but the fact that the state is part of procuring and securing public space as an important democratic value, whoever you are, independently of whether you're left, right, up, down on the political spectrum.
Any final thoughts on that?
I want to add that the digital literacy that we need, as I think as Europe and in Denmark, we it's important also to educate the population to be able to navigate in a digital age. There's a lot of inequality right now. I think Europe is trying to do something about it, trying to educate more. And I'm not talking about this in the way, let's say, Facebook would say that the user has to be in control. I'm talking about broad educational program from your very small kid until you're a senior. We need to be better to understand and also to take responsibility for ourselves and other people, and to be able to participate in the digital space.
Maybe I want to say one last thing that Camilla and I have stressed arguably in the book, namely, we also have to realize that these are early times, right? I mean, we think about it as if we have had the social media all along. It's a new technology, and every new technology introduced in the history of man have always come with teethering diseases. So now it's time to make sure that these don't become chronic illnesses. But we are only looking at a time span of about 25 to 30 years tops. So no wonder that we are still having teething diseases. Now just let's make sure that these do not become chronic. That's all we are saying here. And there are ways in which you can do that between individual mobilization, that means digital literacy, it means also new partnerships, and it means legislation. And that's basically the argument that we are trying to raise in the book.
So individual, institutional, and ideological mobilization.
The 3 I's.
Vincent Hendricks, Camilla Mehlsen, co-authors of The Ministry of Truth, Big Tech's Influence on Facts, Feelings, and Fictions, coming out this spring from Springer Nature. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Reimagining the Internet is hosted by me, Ethan Zuckerman, and produced by Mike Sugarman, who also composed this music. Follow us at publicinfrastructure.org to learn more about what we're up to at the Initiative for Digital Public Infrastructure, and please subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening to it.